organizing MMUULLEE application files. Just as we had separated multiple flows into smaller flows, we also might want to separate our configuration files into multiple config files. Monolithic files are really hard to read and maintain, especially as they grow with more and more flows. And separating that application into smaller configuration files will make your code easier to read and easier to work with when finding different elements, easier to test, and just more maintainable overall. One example of extracting items out into their own config file is to encapsulate global elements. It can be confusing if you reference global elements in one file that are defined in various unrelated files. Think an HTTP requester that you're not sure where its configuration lives. It makes them hard to find, and a good solution that we can go with is to put our global elements that are shared amongst config files in their own config file. All the rest of the files can reference them, and if a global element is specific to and only used in one file, it could make sense just to keep it in that file. We're more thinking global elements that are used throughout multiple config files. Creating multiple applications is also something you might want to consider. You're also not going to want all your flows in a single application or project. You may want to separate concerns by taking functionality and moving it across applications. This is going to allow you to manage and monitor them as separate entities and use different, potentially incompatible libraries or jar files amongst those applications. It'll allow you to run more than one application at a time in Anypoint Studio, and Anypoint Studio will let us do this by having a run config where we can run multiple projects in tandem. So let's get into it with walkthrough 6.3. Encapsulate global elements in a separate config file. We will create a new configuration file with an endpoint that uses an existing global element. We'll create a configuration file that we call global XML for the global elements and move the existing global elements into global XML. Let's get started. Let's start off inside of our APDev examples project. And we're going to start off by creating a brand new XML file called accounts.xml. We'll right-click on our project, choose New MMUULLEE Configuration File, and again call this accounts, and the file name will be accounts.xml. Once you've got this name in place, let's hit Finish. Now from accounts.xml, let's make another flow. This flow will be exposed on HTTP. We'll drag our HTTP listener into the canvas, and this will, of course, create a flow. By selecting the HTTP listener, let's make sure our existing listener config is set, and let's set our path to SFDC, or salesforce.com, as you'll see us use a little bit later. We'll also set the allowed methods to get to ensure we can only receive GET requests. In the process phase of the flow, let's add a logger in. So we'll drag the logger into process. With the logger in place, let's make sure we change the flow name so it makes sense what it's here for. And we're going to call this the get SFDC accounts flow. All right, so for now, this flow won't do much, but eventually we're going to use it to get data out of Salesforce. Now let's switch to our global elements view inside. You'll notice inside of our global elements view that we currently don't have any global elements, but we are referencing some. We're using an HTTP listener from another XML, APDev examples. So in this case, we want to look at extracting our reusable XML global elements into a separated XML file. So let's do that. We'll right-click inside of APDev examples, and we'll create another new MMUULLEE configuration file. This MMUULLEE configuration file we'll call global, or global XML. And we'll hit Finish. Now, inside of global XML, let's go to the configuration XML view. Specifically, let's find where the MMUULLEE tag ends. So you can see here the MMUULLEE tag begins, and if we go inside of here to where the MMUULLEE tag ends, we're going to add some breaks in order to kind of give ourselves a gap, and you'll see in a moment how this will be helpful. All right, now that we've got some gaps in our global XML, let's return to our APDev examples project. Now, if we switch to the global elements in AP Dev examples, you can see both our listener and requester live in this XML file. So as this app grows out and multiple XMLs start referencing these listeners and requesters, it might be harder to find where they live because it's just an arbitrary location at this point. Now, let's see if we can move these over to the global XML. When moving elements between different XML files, it's often much easier to do it in the configuration XML, and that's what we're going to do now. So I'll double click on this tab just to make it a bit bigger and easier to see. On lines 11 and 12 in my configuration, yours may vary, somewhere towards the top of your config at least, you'll see the listener config and the request config. Let's go ahead and copy or essentially cut, so remove and copy those specific elements from your config. Let's go back to the global tab inside of here, and let's paste those elements inside of the global XML. Now, after we've pasted the listener and requester inside of global XML, let's go inside of global elements. And if you do see that the global elements are unknown at this point, that just means that the schema didn't update since we directly copied the HTTP elements over. The XML namespaces in the top of the file weren't updated. So a really easy way that we can work around this is to just create a fake HTTP endpoint. So I'll do HTTP and create a fake HTTP request config and hit OK. And OK again. And if we go back into the XML, what you'll notice happens here is it actually puts this XML namespace inside. So you could have manually put this in, but it's far more convenient to just let the GUI do it for us. And that will not only put in the namespace, but also put a reference to the schema location as well. So once you've got that element in, you can delete that little mock requester we just made, either from the XML, or you could go back to the GUI and delete it as well. We effectively just want to be left with our HTTP listener config and request config that we copied over originally. So now let's be sure to save up the entire project. And if we go back to AP Dev examples and click on the message flow tab, we can run the project. Once the project has started up successfully, we should be able to go back to Postman and make a simple request in which we should get our old response goodbye back to us from our client. So now we've successfully extracted our global XML inside of its own element, and we are sharing configuration references from both the accounts XML and the AP Dev examples XML. Let's hop into the next section.